In my mind, the Settlement Act itself is a two-edged sword, almost like everything that we have inherited from the Western world. You know, from the telephone to salt to coffee to iPods and computers. I mean, things cut at least two ways or more. There's always a positive and a negative. And our problem is that, like most humans, we never think about the downside of new technologies and new institutions. And as I mentioned earlier, the thrust of the federal government has been to try to break down tribal structures and people with a different culture into this vast melting pot. And so in many ways, that was the anticipation and hope, by Congress in the creation of the corporation. It may not be spelled out per se, but to me, that doesn't, just because the Congress anticipated such a thing occurring doesn't mean that we have to play that game, And so I have tried to convey the notion that if we lose our identity as Native people, in the long run, the Congress will have won. Because, at some point, if the language and the culture and the history and the genealogy and the land and the music and the dance and the stories become meaningless to our people, then if it comes down to a choice between them as a Native person versus the dollars, then they're going to go for the dollars. Sometime 50 or 100 years from now, if there's such a proposal to dispose of the assets and take your share and run, then that's the end, right? But the thing is, it's set up so that the decision about the future is really in the hands, of the shareholders, the Native people that hold that stock. And of course, my hope is that, people remember who they are, value their culture, value their heritage, and use the corporation as a tool that was meant to be for our survival. 50 years ago, 35 years ago, there was no thought that our people would ever be involved in the magnitude of enterprises and the complexity of enterprises and the breadth and depth of enterprises that we do now. I mean, we would not have a single Native office, building, office, corporation, in a place like this if we had not had the settlement. We would have been consumers out there at the whim of whoever's, manipulating the economy. Our own people now have a stake, in the economy and have an ability to function not only in Alaska, but anywhere in the world. Now, that whole notion was unheard of. Most non-natives thought we could not run a thing, and our people have proved them otherwise. In my memoir, I wrote a chapter called Epiphany and Nome, which was a very hard chapter to write because I think most of us, including several generations before my time even, have been under a lot of pressure, whether we understood it or not, but to conform to an American, Western, English-speaking paradigm. And it's been a constant theme every day of our lives since the beginning of the missionary era in the 1880s, and through a concentrated effort by the federal government in conjunction with the church groups to change our identities, our values, our language. They purposely really did not include anything of our history or of our culture or of the vast amount of knowledge that our people had gained over 10,000 years of living in this part of the world. I never really understood most of that. And of course, we did everything we could to be good citizens, in spite of the fact that we did not have any legal status of any consequence between 1867 and 1924. So there was literally no way for Native people to protect themselves from the onslaught of the mining world and the growth of the canned salmon industry along all of the coastal areas that began to take our food. And they were drumming our languages out of us during that period of time, and every other major institution that knitted our people together. And it finally came home to me just a single night in Nome on the way to Kotzebue back in 1980. And it was a pretty powerful impression, because, you know, we pick up little bits and pieces of knowledge and wisdom along the way, but oftentimes don't quite put it together. And I'm not saying that I understand a lot, but I understood a hell of a lot more that particular night than I ever had in the previous, 40 years of my life. That is the constant pressure, the sort of the disconnections that were taking place within our own families, within our own cultures. And it was pretty grim in my mind to see the extent of the destruction that had been taking place in all the various values and practices and methods of behavior and knowledge that all of our people had shared. And so I was literally, I was really at a low point because we'd tried, we'd gotten involved, in politics to try to improve the physical conditions of our communities, to try to improve our living conditions in every manner possible. And then we had gotten, strenuously involved in trying to get control of our space, our land. And then we had to put all this energy into just trying to figure out how to run an enterprise. But at the same time, though, I began to see that from just a human perspective, we were no better off. That is, we were still going to jail, we were still fighting, we were still drinking, we were still, from a societal standpoint, we were going to hell in a handbasket. And so it made me wonder, well, geez, what really are we doing, And so it was a sort of a soul searching. And so I went back to Kotzebue. I went out in the country, and I got the feeling that we were sort of without a philosophy, that is, we didn't have a sense of where we were going. And then I felt that in many ways we were sort of digging our own grave because of our ignorance from a cultural standpoint. Because the way I looked at it, we had gone after the settlement to try to get control of our space so that our people and our cultures can survive. Because the way I look at it, no, human, animal, or plant, or insect species wants to self-destruct. In fact, if anything, they'll do anything to survive as a community, right? As a consciousness, right? And so that really was what gave rise to Inupiaq.